by way of introduction, for those of you who haven't met us before or haven't attended an FW webinar, my name's Peter Wright. I'm the head of the Financial Services and Investigations practice at Fox Williams, and for my sin, I'm a former regulator as well. Today, we're going to be talking about the new FCA investment firms prudential regime, and in particular, focusing on the remuneration code provisions, which are going to be extended out to firms within the scope of these rules. If we could go on to the next slide, please. To give a bit of an overview as to what we're going to look at, we've got two main sections. The new rules, these are going to be dealt with by my colleague Chris Finney, who leads our advisory practice in our regulatory team. And the second part of the talk on the gender neutral remuneration policies is going to be covered by my colleague Joanna Chatterton, who is the head of our employment team. So from my perspective, good news for this presentation is I'm asking Chris and Jo to do all the heavy lifting this morning. In terms of a few other minor housekeeping matters, there is a Q&A function as part of this seminar. So if there are any questions that you would like to ask as you go along, please do feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'll try to keep an eye on them as we go and either answer them as we go if we can, or pick them up at the end. And I know we've had at least one question from the audience as part of the talk towards the end as well. So we will canter through the presentations this morning and then allow some time for questions at the end too. So without any more, I'm just going to do a quick introduction and background recap to what I will call the code. If we could go on to the next slide, thank you. I've actually been involved in dealing with remuneration issues ever since the very first, and you can see on the slide I put remuneration code in inverted commas, was introduced. And actually, this was all the way back when we still had the FSA rather than the FCA in 2009. And when this came in, it was actually only targeting the very, very largest firms, which were principally, or would now be PRA regulated firms. So the systemically important banks, building societies, and investment firms and insurers as well. And it was based on very, very high financial thresholds. Now, the reason for this is that the REM code came out of the financial crisis. And the real concern there was that a number of the really significant failings of financial institutions and some of the things that we saw in the US in relation to sale of credit default swaps and other inappropriate financial instruments between the very large institutions, actually the behaviors which led to that kind of risk-taking business and the threats that were then posed to the institutions was perceived, and I think quite correctly, as a result of incentive in remuneration structures which encouraged those behaviors, whether it was directly linked to driving particular business into the income, into the firm, or generating revenues in a particular way with a short-term focus, which would then feed through to individuals' remuneration, whether that was by way of bonus or other structuring. But all of those concerns there was that effectively remuneration and reward drives conduct in behavior. And actually what is needed is a much more long-term approach to ensure that appropriate behaviors are fostered through reward and remuneration structures. Now, the important point there is that the code, and also what we're going to talk about in terms of a IFPR code today, is it's not looking at limiting the absolute quantum of remuneration. That's not what it's involved at all. What it's looked at is how things are structured and how it is delivered. So there isn't actually any bar for very high-paying organisations if that's what they want to do, but how they deliver that will be governed. Just in terms of a bit more overview, following the sort of introduction in 2009, the REM code has gradually been extended out to other types of firms, and additional elements have been introduced. Now, when the remuneration code first came in, there were various performance adjustment mechanisms, which I'm sure addressed, such as clawback and malus adjustments. Those arrangements have developed in sophistication over time. And also, I think this is very much as a result of a political push. There was the introduction of what was called the bonus cap. Now, in reality, it's not a cap, as Chris was saying, it's ratio control. In fact, one's variable remuneration cannot exceed a particular multiple of your fixed pay. And we just see that the remuneration code extends over time. And we're going to look at how that's going to work in the IFPR context today. The final sort of background into introductory thought I wanted to leave you with, and this is the area where I have a particular interest, is, well, what happens when this goes wrong? Or what happens if we don't implement rules correctly? Because one of the observations I quite frequently make to clients who I deal with in this area is that it is an area of regulation where the rules are actually quite clear in the sense that you can identify them. And it's very easy to see on a firm's paperwork and documentation as to whether they have implemented or not. And it's also quite easy to identify remuneration payments that are being made and to make a relatively cold assessment of whether or not they were within the letter and spirit of the remuneration code provisions. There are some areas of regulation where actually it's much harder for regulators to show, for example, if you're having to assess a particular individual's judgments on an issue at a particular point, that has a lot more scope for argument. But this is an area where I feel it's quite clear. But what then becomes a little bit unusual is that we have seen almost no, and I've not identified any final notices, enforcement action where the FCA, as a freestanding case, has taken action against a firm for either failing to implement a remuneration code provision or making a payment to an individual which is in breach of it. Now, this is not to downplay at all the importance of this area, and quite the contrary. I think this is an area where it is very, very easy for the FCA to take robust supervisory action against a firm if its remuneration structures are not up to scratch. And also, it's a very easy thing for the regulators to audit on a visit basis. And it often does come up on supervisory visits in terms of, well, how does remuneration play into your overall governance framework? And so it is therefore very, very important to that's up to scratch because it's an easy area of challenge. Also, what I anticipate is that there are, certainly from instances I've seen, breaches of the remuneration code, and that it would be quite easy for the FCA, as part of a broader investigation, if it identifies REM code breaches, to add that in either as an additional breach as part of their case, or perhaps as an aggravating factor, again, if the remuneration policies actually led to the failings that were identified. So I really do think it's an area that is important for every single firm to be aware of their obligations and make sure that they take sensible steps to implement it. And so on that note, I'm going to hand over to Chris to explain the new regime and how it will impact.
Peter, thank you. As Peter mentioned, I'm a partner. I lead our non-contentious financial services regulatory practice. A little bit like Peter, then I've been doing this this sort of work, regulatory only, for 20 years. And again, like Peter, for the first 10 years of my career as a regulatory lawyer, I was at the Financial Services Authority. We worked together there during the banking crisis on some of those things. If we just start then with the basics on the new rules for investment firms for remuneration code. These new rules will apply to the first remuneration period, which begins on or after the 1st of January 2022, whether that's a remuneration period of a year or a quarter or something else. That you'll find them all in CISC 19G, and they'll replace over time the two other sets of rules that were in CISC and applying to different sorts of investment firms. There are, the rules themselves are actually quite complicated or quite confusing, at least in the beginning, and they're quite inconsistent, it seems, with the description of the rules in both the consultation paper and the policy statement. That's really quite unfortunate. When you start to look at them, you'll see 4 pages of application provisions, and then at the end you'll see a table which says, in other words, which always tells you they're in trouble because they've used so many double negatives and triple negatives that it's really difficult to work out what's happening. And then you'll see a table which begins to explain which of the rules in CISC 19G apply to which sorts of firm. And actually, there are so many double negatives and triple negatives that you'll begin to wonder whether or not there are mistakes in the rules. And I think there might be, but we can worry about that later. For the moment, let's break it down into its simplest form. This isn't apparent on the first or second reading of the rules, but it's quite clear from the consultation paper and the policy statement, and it is consistent with the rules after some work to get there. We see 3 different sorts of investment firms and 3 layers of requirements for those firms. We've got these small non-interconnected firms, the SNIs. They have to comply with the basic remuneration requirements. There are 7 groups of rules for those. The non-SNIs, so firms that aren't small and non-interconnected, have to comply with the basic and the standard, and the large non-SNIs have to comply with the extended. It's slightly confusing again because the whole of CISC 19G is the remuneration code, and if you are a large non-SNI, you'll have to comply with all of the rules in that chapter. What's happening instead is that if you're an SNI, you only have to comply with 7 of them, 7 groups of those rules, and if you're a non-SNI but not a large one, you have to comply with 4 more. So everything starts then with whether or not you're an SNI, a small non-interconnected investment firm. If we could just go on to the next slide, then we can have a bit of a refresher on that one. I'm saying a refresher because I'm anticipating that by now most of you will have worked out whether or not your firm is an SNI. But the gist of it is that for MiFID activities, you'll be an SNI if your answer is no to all of the questions in that list of questions. And if your answer is yes to any of them, you'll be a non-SNI. And you'll be a large SNI if not only are you a non-SNI, you'll be a large SNI if, a large non-SNI if your balance sheet total over a rolling 4-year average period is, just forgive me because my notes are behind the screen, more than £300 million on average. That's balance sheet assets on and off the balance sheet, or it's between 100 and 300 million. But your exposure value to on and off balance sheet trading book is 150 million or more, or your derivatives business is 100 million or more. If we could just go on then to the next slide, here's just a summary of the rules you'll see that will apply to you if you're an SNI, a non-large non-SNI, or a large non-SNI. Basic requirements only for the SNIs, basic and standard for the large non-SNIs, and extended for the large non-SNIs. I'm just going to run through some of those briefly now. I would just, before I do, because I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on the 4 different, the different rules for the large non-SNIs, but those I've marked with an asterisk. There's an exemption for, so the rules in that column are all applied to your material risk takers, a term you're familiar with and we'll come back to in a moment, but there's an exemption for those individual material risk takers if their annual variable remuneration does not exceed £167,000 and does not represent more than 1/3 of their total annual remuneration. So if we could just go on to the next slide, please, we'll have a look at the the start of the basic requirements, we see there then that every investment firm must establish, implement and maintain an appropriate and proportionate remuneration policy and remuneration practices for all staff. The rules have been deliberately designed to capture all staff. That will include, it will include contractors. If you're a partnership, it will include your partners, even though you might not otherwise think of your partners as staff. So pretty well everybody who's working in the investment firm. Some phrases that you'll be familiar with, again, from some of these rules then: the policy must be appropriate and proportionate to the nature, scale and complexity of the firm and the risks within it. It must be gender neutral, and Joe will talk to us a little bit later about gender neutrality and some of the employment law principles that that will pull in. As you would expect, your remuneration policy and your practices must be consistent with and promote sound and effective risk management for the reasons that Peter mentioned. It must be consistent with your business strategy, your objectives and your long-term interests. And it must include measures to avoid conflicts of interest and encourage responsible business conduct, promoting at all appropriate levels risk awareness and prudent risk taking. This policy is a policy, like most regulatory policies, that must be adopted and periodically reviewed by your management body. In most businesses, your board, but if you're a partnership, perhaps in the partnership board or the similar body or committee that you have within your organisation. And it must be developed, adopted and periodically reviewed with support from your risk function, if you have one, your compliance function, your internal audit function, HR and the relevant business units. And then the implementation of this policy and these practices, once adopted, must be overseen by your remuneration committee, again, if you have one. So for these firms, for SNIs, there's no obligation here to establish a remuneration committee. It's just that if you have one, the remuneration committee has to oversee the implementation of the policies and practices. A bit of a tongue twister, as well as all these double negatives in the application provisions. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So again, some concepts that you'll be familiar with. For the controlled functions, as you would expect, they must still be independent of the business units they oversee. They must still be given appropriate authority. I can see Peter's eyebrows twitching at this. You wonder why this is in the remuneration code. I certainly do, but there we are. They must be given appropriate authority to do the jobs they've been given. It doesn't say this in CISC, but they must be paid appropriately so that they can do their job properly too. And then their remuneration must be set in a way which is consistent with the achievement of objectives linked to their functions. But those objectives, although those objectives must be linked to their functions, their remuneration must be set independently of the performance of the area that they're responsible for managing. And then the remuneration of the senior officers and the risk and compliance functions must be overseen by your remuneration committee if you have one, and by your board if you don't. As you might expect, and again, this is still consistent with the current codes, the regulators are expecting you to split remuneration into a fixed component and into a variable component. For SNIs, they have to be appropriately balanced, but the regulators, the FCA, is not expecting you to fix an appropriate proportion between fixed and variable. That changes as we get into the non-SNIs, but we can come back to that. You'll be used to the idea then that the fixed compensation must reflect experience, responsibility. It's something that's permanent, predetermined, non-discretionary, non-revocable, and perhaps slightly curiously, doesn't depend on performance. I'm saying slightly curious because I think that fixed compensation almost invariably depends on performance to a degree. When you have somebody in your organisation and you're into year 2, year 3, year 4, it would be a surprise, I think, if you weren't moving them further up a band, if you're using bands to recognise that they're a star performer, and perhaps increasing their salary more slowly if they're not. The point there really, I think, is that it mustn't change having been fixed, depending on performance. And then variable compensation, as you would expect, based on performance, both long-term and in excess of job description and terms of employment. The FCA are quite keen to stress that it must be possible for you to award no variable performance. You sort of reading between the lines, you almost wonder if it's actually saying that for some, and perhaps anyway for all, we should get ourselves into a position where people will expect that in some years there won't be any variable compensation. Variable is something that really should be for something that's over and above the ordinary, rather than something that's part of your general package. When you're assessing variable compensation, again, carry over from the current code, performance when it's assessed must take into account both financial and non-financial metrics. And for those who follow those things, you'll see them stressing here that one of the things that you might take into account when you're assessing performance on a non-financial metric might be the achievement of ESG objectives or D&I objectives or D&I targets. If we go on to the next slide, please. So I'm moving on here then to the requirements for non-SNIs, but not SNIs. It's only non-SNIs that must identify their material risk takers. This is something that must be done at least once a year. The FCA recognising that people might become material risk takers during the course of the year, and they might stop being material risk takers during the course of the year. And that movement then requiring the business to assess at least once a year that it's got a correct, it's correctly categorised and identified every material risk taker. As you'd expect, a material risk taker is still somebody who's a staff member whose professional activities have a material impact on the risk profile of the firm or the assets it manages. There's a rule in CISC 19G53 which gives a very long list of individuals who are deemed to be material risk takers. And again, they won't be much of a surprise. Members of the management body, when it's sitting in its management function or when it's sitting in its supervisory function, members of the firm's senior management, those with managerial responsibility for managing parts of the business or the business units that engage in certain regulated activities, dealing investments as agent, for example, dealing investments as principal, managing investments and advising. And then also material risk takers, those with managerial responsibilities for the prevention of money laundering and terrorist financing. And in some organisations, if they carry on the regulated activities that I've mentioned, those who have responsibility for information technology and information technology security as well. The first thing for this group of individuals then is that when you assess their performance, you must assess their performance, as we said, for SNIs, taking into account financial and non-financial performance, but you must also assess their performance, taking into account their individual performance, the performance of their business unit and the performance of the firm, and take a full business cycle approach and look at the way in which the business is performing over its normal business cycle. Probably not much of a surprise there for those of you who are already doing these things. But one of the things that's happening here is that some of the boundaries are moving. So some firms will find themselves having to do things for the first time, and other firms will find themselves with some much more stringent remuneration code requirements from January than they're subject to now. And then just on the last 4 bullet points on this slide, guaranteed variable remuneration, new hires or new customers only, retention rewards for material risk takers, only if you set particular requirements or which must be met before the retention reward is paid. So they must, for example, stay for a minimum period to actually receive the money, or they must perform particular objectives to actually receive the money. severance pay is still fine, but there mustn't be any rewards for failure. And if you're buying out some awards from a previous employer, that's still fine as well, as long as your deferral and vesting periods are no shorter than they were for the awards you're buying out. Can we go on to the last slide, please? Thank you. So this is just for the large non-SNIs. Some of these things will be familiar again, certainly the first three. If you're going to pay variable remuneration, then if you're a large SNI, then at least 50% of the variable compensation that you pay to a material risk taker must be paid in shares or shared linked instruments or other eligible instruments. Your retention policy, you must have a retention policy, and it must be designed to establish an appropriate retention for eligible interest designed to align the interests of staff member with the long-term interests of the firm, its creditors and its clients. Deferrals are obligatory. You must not award, pay or provide variable remuneration component unless at least 40% of it's deferred over a period of at least 3 years. And if it's a particularly high amount, and they leave you to work out what a particularly high amount is, but in all cases where the variable remuneration is more than £500,000, at least 60% of it must be deferred rather than at least 40%. And again, over at least 3 years, but reading between the lines, you get the impression that the FCA would prefer that you deferred it for longer. Then again, for these large non-SNIs, an obligation, if you don't already have one, to establish a risk committee, a nomination committee and a remuneration committee. These committees must be at least 50% non-executives, and you have to remember that the chair of these committees must be a senior management function holder. So if you're going to be a large non-SNI and you're going to establish a risk committee, a nomination committee or a remuneration committee for the first time, the person that you're going to ask to chair that committee will have to be pre-approved by the FCA before the committee is established and before they can take control of it. Can we just go on to the next slide, please? So I just identified some 4 short things that you could do now to prepare for this regime if you haven't already done it. Check which sort of firm you are. Are you an SNI, a non-SNI, or a large non-SNI? Work out which rules apply to you then. You might find that you're in a position where you can relax some of your internal arrangements, but you'll need to tighten up some others. If there's an opportunity to relax, you'll need to consider carefully whether or not you're going to take advantage of it, and if you are, how you'll move into this new world. I've put consider over-implementing with a question mark because the FCA is quite keen that every firm should at least think about whether it will comply with the rules as if it was the next category up, and if not all of the rules as if it was the next category up, then at least some of them. I'm not sure that very many firms will choose to do that unless they're expecting that within the short or medium term, they'll move from one category to the next in any event. And you might then consider over-implementing as a way of smoothing your transition from one category of firm to the next. And then the last, of course, at least in the FCA's view, many firms will be subject to stricter requirements than before. And if that's the case, I would expect that Joe would be encouraging you to look at your employment contracts and to be having some fairly early conversations with the people who will be affected by the new rules, the new policies that you might need to adopt, or the changes in your existing policies. I'm going to pass over to Joe now then to talk to us about gender-neutral remuneration policies. I'm quite a tongue twister this morning, so it's triple negatives, double negatives.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm the odd one out in this lineup because I actually have never worked in a regulator, but I've heard lots of war stories from Peter and Chris, so I kind of feel like I've been there. So if I could have the first slide, please, Jeff. So under the new regime, there will be new requirements for FCA investment firms remuneration policies and practices to be gender neutral. So it's not enough just to have a policy which states that there won't be discrimination on grounds of gender. You must demonstrate that you're going to apply this in practice. And the FCA defines a gender neutral remuneration policy in its glossary, and it's one which it says is based on equal pay for male and female workers for equal work and work of equal value. Now, some of you will be aware that in the UK, we've had legislation since the 1970s aimed at ensuring gender equality in relation to pay and terms of employment. And that was in the Equal Pay Act, and that's now enshrined in the Equality Act of 2010. And the FCA definition looks to mirror these legal requirements as regard equal pay. So if we could have the next slide, please, Jess. Thank you. So given that we've got legislation in place already, in theory, you should have gender neutral remuneration policy and practice consistent with the Equality Act already. And if you don't, then you could be exposed to claims by individual employees in the Employment Tribunal. The difference now is that it's become an FCA rule, or it will become an FCA rule, that you ensure you have gender neutral policy and practice. So any firm caught by these rules now becomes accountable to the FCA for this. And I think this is part of a trend that we can see from the FCA in its long-standing focus on culture and its pronouncements about non-financial misconduct such as harassment and discrimination as being a breach of its conduct rules, including the Conduct Rule 1, which is the requirement to act with integrity. So if you don't have a gender neutral remuneration policy, or you don't apply gender neutrality in practice, then I think the individual who is first going to be on the hook to the FCA will be the senior manager who has the prescribed responsibility for overseeing the remuneration policy. Now, there's no specific prescribed responsibility for remuneration in the UK investment firm, and it's likely that that will be then assigned to maybe your compliance oversight, your CEO, or if your head of HR is a senior manager, to the head of HR. And I think that what the angle that the FCA will take here is that a failure to apply gender neutrality in pay is likely to be a breach of senior conduct rule number 2, which requires a senior management function holder to take reasonable steps to ensure that the part of the business that they're responsible for complies with relevant requirements and standards of the regulatory system. So if the FCA wanted to take action against an individual senior manager, then that could involve fines, it could involve prohibitions, and it may involve public and private censures. And if they want to go against the firm itself, again, there could be fines, and there may be public or private censures. But one question I think which arises is, how will the FCA know? How proactive are they going to be about scrutinising your remuneration policy? Now, we think it's probably unlikely that the FCA is going to proactively come looking specifically to review your remuneration policy. The circumstances in which it's likely to come to the FCA's attention are if, for example, there's a whistleblow, or perhaps a finding in the Employment Tribunal that there's been discrimination in pay, and that might prompt an inquiry and an audit. It may also be, as Peter said, that it's one of the questions that's going to come up in the supervisory visit as part of a sort of standard review checklist. So you can expect questions in that context. Or there may, of course, be a thematic review by the FCA. Our collective view is that we think it's unlikely we're going to see immediate enforcement action against senior managers and firms on this. What's more likely to happen is that the firm will be told to take steps to improve their policy and practices rather than face enforcement action. But of course, action can result if the FCA's advice and guidance is not followed. And I think it's fair to say that this is quite a tricky area for the FCA. The whole question of equality and diversity is not in its normal purview. And it's really stuck its neck out on this one because the PRA and the Bank of England, for example, have steered well clear of specific rules about gender neutral pay under CRD 5, given that we already have equalities legislation in place to cover this. So I think it's difficult for the FCA to backtrack on the approach it took in that context and now not apply it here. But I think generally it's likely to exercise some caution especially in light of some recent decisions we've had where we see the upper tribunal pushing back on decisions that the FCA has made around non-financial misconduct, particularly involving discrimination and harassment. If I could have the next slide, please, Jess. Thank you. So if you're going to be asked questions in a supervisory visit, for example, what do you need to do now to make sure that you can demonstrate to the FCA that you've satisfied their requirements and you've implemented a gender neutral policy and you're following that in practice? Now, the FCA will likely want to see some evidence that you've responded proactively to the new rules by taking a critical look at your pay practices in place now and your policy to satisfy yourself that you do in fact meet the requirements. And it may well be that no change is needed, but it's good to be able to demonstrate to the FCA that you have or how you've reached that conclusion. So I think a helpful first step is to sort of be kicking the tires on what are your risk areas in terms of your remuneration system. And I've highlighted some examples of those on the slide, which I've come across as issues in investment firms in my practice. And they've often arisen in the context of grievances and claims brought by individuals about their treatment by the firm. So the first area of likely risk you need to think about is a lack of transparency in your pay and your grading systems, because employment tribunals certainly make it clear that they will not look favourably on employers who don't have transparent pay structures when they're considering equal pay claims. I think the question you need to be asking is whether you are clear and transparent in your policy about your processes and gradings and how you determine remuneration. The acid test really being, if you asked a staff member how their bonus and pay is determined, would they be able to tell you? Discretionary bonus schemes are always an area of risk. It's lawful to have a discretionary bonus scheme or discretion over what you reward to your staff under long-term incentive plans, for example, provided that any factors used to justify differences in bonus and awards are not discriminatory. So the risk of pay discrimination tends to be greater if bonus and incentive awards aren't linked to quantifiable and easily explained factors. So consider what factors you do take into account when you're exercising your discretion. A good example of one which sometimes can be quite problematic is a requirement that an individual has shown commitment to the firm or their role. And that can be quite difficult to quantify, but people who work part-time, for example, those with caring needs for young children, may potentially be disproportionately negatively impacted in an assessment of their commitment to the firm if they're viewed as putting their sort of family needs before the needs of the firm. Another risk area is where you have a large degree of managerial discretion over starting salaries. Individuals who are joining, transferring or being promoted might receive different starting salaries for very good and lawful reasons, but the greater degree of managerial discretion, the greater the likelihood there is for discrepancies and unfairness to creep into the system. I think that's particularly the case where there's no, say, board or HR oversight over decisions around pay. Another area I've come across actually quite frequently over the last few months are complaints around the use of market-based pay. Now, firms often set pay or pay supplements on top of base salary to address recruitment and retention difficulties. And again, that can be lawful, provided that you can prove that the differences in pay between employees undertaking equal work are properly attributable to the pressures in the labour market, such as skills shortages or competitive pressures in the sector, and that they don't have anything to do with sex. Pay rises, non-payment of bonuses or other incentives in maternity leave, an age-old problem, largely stemming from the fact that the kind of rules around what you pay people on maternity leave, for example, aren't properly understood. So where you do have staff who are taking maternity leave or other types of leave, such as adoption leave or parental leave, make sure that you understand what the requirements are before you go into your pay discussions. And then finally, possibly not something that many investment firms have, but that may depend on their size, are job evaluations. Job evaluation schemes can be really useful evidence that discrimination hasn't occurred, because you'll be able to justify the reasons why you pay different people in different roles at different amounts of money. But a scheme that's not kept up to date can be problematic, and it won't provide the defence in an equal pay claim. So if procedures aren't followed, or people have changed jobs, or if you don't have up-to-date records, a tribunal may not accept that the job has been adequately evaluated. If I could have the next slide, please, Jess. So once you've had a look at what your risk areas are, the next step, I think, will be to consider an audit of your pay practices focusing on these risks. And sorry, I've just noticed that should read firm rather than bank on the slide there. And that audit should identify if any changes are needed. And the list on the slide, again, not an exhaustive list, because the areas that you're going to look at will largely depend on the particular risks that you've identified in your particular firm. But I think, given what we said, the 5 points that I've listed are areas which you're likely to need to have a kick the tires on. So the first of those are around how you determine starting salaries. That's not just when someone joins, it's when someone's job changes significantly, or their grading is reviewed, or if they're promoted to a new job or grade. And the important thing is to set yourself off on the right foot. So establishing a clear policy on setting starting salaries with appropriate manager oversight is highly advisable. How you assess competence is obviously important, because it feeds into decision about pay and promotions. And when I say pay, of course, we mean bonus as well as base salary. So that, for investment firms, includes an assessment of how well someone's doing against the firm's requirements, but also how they're doing in terms of their regulatory performance. And you need to make sure that there's no gender bias built into the system of assessing competence and how you evaluate in annual appraisals or through the course of the year. So, for example, do you properly evaluate part-time workers or those on maternity or other parental leaves or career breaks? The other thing you need to think about is ensuring that all employees do have access to opportunities to develop the right levels of competence. So, for example, think about the timing and location of any training that you give, and how that accommodates part-time workers who may have caring responsibilities, or those on maternity and other parental leaves. And think about access to work opportunities, not just giving the best work and opportunity to those who are always present in the office and not working flexibly or in a hybrid way, for example, particularly if they're working remotely because it's associated with health reasons or, again, childcare needs. One of the questions that I've recently discussed with a client was a question on an appraiser form, which asked the assessors to say how likely they were to choose this particular individual to give work to. And I think that kind of question is very problematic, because it suggests that if for some reason, and in this particular case, the employee asserted that it was because she was a woman who'd raised a grievance about harassment, if the manager doesn't like giving work to the team member, his answer to that question effectively highlights there may not be equal opportunities being given in terms of work allocation. How performance-related bonuses are determined and how discretion is exercised by managers, again, another area of obvious focus. Performance-related elements are, of course, standard in investment firms, where performance-related bonuses and other rewards and award schemes are used to reward and retain employees. But essentially, they reward people who do the same job differently. And that can, of course, increase the risk of unequal pay between men and women. So it's helpful often to have a look at the bonuses that you've paid to men and women in your firm over the last few years. And if there's a tendency to pay to favour one gender over another, just check and make sure you're clear that the difference can be justifiable and it's not related to anyone's gender. And that might be not just conscious bias, I've mentioned unconscious bias and factors may be at play. I think it's fair to say that where we have managers who have a lot of discretion over pay, that does need to be carefully and centrally monitored, because there is room for that bias to creep in. So think about the checks and balances that you have in place over managerial discretion in all elements of the pay package, and think about the moderation and oversight that you may need over those pay decisions, and whether that needs to change. I think it's worth thinking about whether you give some training to people who pay decisions, because that's really good evidence that you've taken your obligation seriously, and the FCA will be pleased to see that kind of approach. I think it's important also to think about how you record pay decisions. I'm not suggesting a sort of chapter and verse, but a brief synopsis of the reasons why you've chosen to pay people a certain amount, so that if it comes to the point where there's a dispute, or that the FCA is asking you questions about your policy, you can go back to what was in your mind at the time to justify the decisions that you made. So think about whether you've got appropriate forms in the pay review process to make it easy for managers to do this. Have a look critically at how you're addressing market forces and their impact on pay in the firm. As I said, market forces can provide a defence to an equal pay claim, but the scope is limited. I've certainly dealt with claims which have been defended on this basis, but you need very good evidence of the market factors that you rely on for that pay differential. You have to be able to show that you had to pay the additional amount to fill the vacancy because of market forces, essentially. And it's going to be easier to do this if perhaps you've had that additional amount paid as a separate market supplement rather than sort of baked into the base salary. It's also helpful to do it if you record the evidence that led you to pay the market supplement at the time that you took the decision, not with hindsight. It's also helpful that you review the evidence and the additional amount regularly to check whether additional payment is still justified. That might happen at the pay review for all staff. And then I think the other important thing is don't just pay a market supplement to a new recruit if it's no longer justified because market forces have changed. So consider whether you need any policy or guidance on this and how you address it in your pay review system. And as I've also mentioned, just finally, be careful of out-of-date pay grades and old structures, because these can be a risk area. So if you've not looked at those, have a look in your audit and identify if they're up to date. And a bit like the steps that you take to identify risk areas, record the analysis that you undertake when you're auditing your pay and remuneration structures generally, so that the FCA can see them if they've asked to. Again, they will look favourably on you if you can demonstrate that you've critically looked at your pay structures. If I could have the next slide, please, Jess. So also you need to put in place the appropriate paperwork to ensure that it reflects the equality requirement. And the obvious, of course, place to look is your remuneration policy, which may need to be updated to reflect the new rules, but also to reflect any changes that you identify from your risk assessment and your audit, which need to be made. Now, many policies already refer to the aim of ensuring equal pay on gender grounds and indeed other grounds, but as a minimum, that does need to be added to the policy if it's not there to highlight that aim. And given what we've said about transparency, it can be really helpful, I think, to summarise in the policy or refer to separate policies and protocols, matters around the processes that you undertake for determining pay, the factors that the bank takes into account when the firm takes into account when determining bonuses, keeping that as flexible, of course, so that it can be changed to reflect changes in the market. Refer, if you do this, to how you train pay and bonus decision makers around equalities issues. And as we've mentioned, think about reflecting in your policy the fact that you have a practice around starting salaries and how market-based factors should be managed. Now, the second document to look at is your equal opportunity statement, and it's likely that you have one of those. It's probably in your employee handbook, and it's essentially a declaration that you treat everyone equally. But all too often, firms and indeed other FS businesses have them, but they don't really give them too much thought and think about their focusing on them or the meaning that they attribute to them. So have a think about how equal opportunity is promoted, practiced and monitored at the firm, and reflect that in your policy so that it becomes tailored to your particular practice. And obviously, if you're not doing anything in the equalities and diversity arena, think about what you might do, because that will all help create the right impression with the FCA. And of course, it feeds into the FCA's ongoing focus around culture, which includes issues around diversity and inclusion. And then finally, just consider whether you want to put in place some written guidance to managers about making pay and bonus decisions, what is relevant and irrelevant factors, because these can be a really useful way of demonstrating to the FCA that the firm has taken steps to try to eliminate gender inequality in pay. But that's all the paperwork, and that's kind of relatively easy to put in place. The absolute key thing is that you put into practice what you say in the policies, because the FCA is going to be interested not just in the wording, but what you do in practice. So what you communicate is helpful, but it's not as helpful as it could be if you do something different in reality. I should add that it's helpful to keep the review of the impact of any changes that you make as a result of your audit and the change in policies and practice, maybe every few years, or perhaps gathering data to see if you can track changes, so that you, not only is that helpful for you to troubleshoot issues which may arise, but again, it will help to demonstrate to the FCA that you're proactively looking at things around equality on an ongoing basis. Finally, I just want to sort of think about what might be the next step from the FCA in terms of equality. So if I could have the next slide, please, Jess. Now, under CISC 19G2.7G, which I've put on the slide, you'll see that the guidance is not limited to gender-related equality, and that reflects discrimination law under the Equalities Act. It goes beyond the rule that you should have gender neutrality. This is, as I said, only guidance, it's not a rule. But it's worth bearing in mind that it may be this is a thin end of a much larger wedge. And if I can have the next slide, please, Jess. I've just highlighted here all of the different protected characteristics, as they're known under the Equality Act, which are covered, and which may be areas which the FCA wants to focus on and make its next rule. I think they're particularly interested around race and nationality discrimination. So we may see that is the sort of next step. Now, obviously, you shouldn't have policies which discriminate on any of these grounds. But at the moment, you're not answerable to the FCA in relation to these, but you may be in the future. So perhaps bear that in mind when you have a look at your systems and think about whether any of these issues also come into play. That's all I've got to say. So I'll hand back to Peter, I think.
Yes, thank you, Jo. That was great. Thank you both, Jo and Chris, for their sections. I am conscious of time, but I've been keenly noting that we've had a number of questions come in as well. So we'll try to answer those briefly for you. But if anyone would like to follow up with either Jo or Chris afterwards, then please do get in touch if a more fulsome answer is needed. And I'm going to take them slightly out of order. But Jo, I know we did have one question come in before the session, which was actually, do we think that this regime extends to contractors as well as sort of direct employees of the firm, and whether you want to just briefly mention that one?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. The term used is staff, and that would cover both employees and contractors, because it wouldn't make much sense to sort of say you could not apply these rules to contractors and have differences in pay based on gender, for example. So the answer to that is yes, contractors will be caught as well.
Excellent. And then just picking up on your section, because the last couple of questions came in from there. It's one of the question was talking about, does the code go well beyond gender neutrality? I think that question just came in before you did the last two slides. So I think that was very interesting to hear from you there. And I think probably it would be worth just exploring those. But the other question we had was, would the FCA take steps only once a tribunal decides that there has been discrimination? In other words, on individual cases, could the FCA take action before a tribunal makes a decision? I don't know what you think of that one, but certainly from my perspective, whenever I've had any enforcement work, normally the FCA is actually pretty slow to want to intervene in sort of individual cases. I don't know if that's something you've seen as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think on balance, the two aren't necessarily tied together. In theory, I think the FCA could take its own enforcement steps without waiting for the tribunal decision. But I think on balance, it's likely that if they know that tribunal proceedings are ongoing, they will wait for the decision, because of course that decision could go either way. Clearly it could be quite powerful for an individual to have an FCA decision on that. So I think that if tribunal proceedings are afoot, the likelihood is that the FCA will wait until they've got the outcome of that and then take action accordingly.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that one as well. And I think if there's any likely to be action, it would probably be a failure to implement the actual rules which Chris described that firms are going to need to put in place. So that probably just takes us into the questions which came out of Chris's section. And again, I'll take them in slightly reverse order. The first one, a bit more techie, and I don't know if it can be. Could you define a large non-SNI firm? Hopefully I haven't got my tongue twisted.
And I can do. I can do. So it's a firm with an average balance sheet total trailing over a 4-year period and including its off-balance sheet assets as well as its on-balance sheet assets of £300 million or more, or with less than 300 million, but at least 100 million of assets, and then a trading book exposure of 150 million or more, or a derivatives business exposure of 100 million or more.
Excellent. That's it. That may be one that people need to scroll down furiously or get in touch on that one just to confirm their firm's position, which I'm sure we'd be delighted to do. And that, I think that leaves the last question, which was actually the first one to come in. So apologies for the ordering, but actually it's an interesting and I think possibly a tricky one, which is, Chris, in relation to remuneration, what is the impact on commission-based sales staff who have no fixed salary but are paid a predetermined percentage of the revenue they bring in?
So that is a tricky question. I can't say that there's I can't say that there's no impact. I suspect there will be some, and I'm going to need to check and actually come back to. Maybe we'll circulate the slides afterwards, and I'll include the answer there. Quite a lot will depend on the type of firm and the type of employee within the firm. It's also likely to depend, I think, on the type of business the firm is doing, or at least the employee is doing, because there's not much room left, I think, now for commission-based sales anyway. That's the first point. The second is that actually there's quite a strong thread running through the code that we shouldn't really be in a world where we're paying no fixed comp, but that doesn't mean we should never pay it, not pay it.
Well, I think again,
there's room for this. But
I agree with you, because actually this is an issue I tackled actually many years ago when the code first came in for the investment banks, and all of their sort of Holly commission-based teams effectively have all gone. And I think, there would need to be some careful analysis, as you said, around the different levels or categories here. But it just strikes me that if this was something which was to continue, from what you were describing earlier, you'd need to really be able to justify how you would deem that to be appropriate in terms of a ratio between, or a blend of fixed and variable, because that sort of, to me, implies inherently there must be a bit of both. And I think also with these 100% commission arrangements, if you're going to also have to implement any kind of deferral or clawback in relation to it, it fundamentally changed the relationship with your staff members. So even if you can get to that sort of place, there's probably a lot of work which will need to be done on it, it strikes me.
The rules do seem to imply that this shouldn't be possible under the new code. And I'm saying that because there's a rule for the basic rule that applies to everybody is there must be an appropriate balance between fixed and variable. And then there's an additional rule for the non-SNIs that they must fix the ratio, and that they can have different ratios for different categories of staff, which I think seems to imply that at least for S&Is, you would have one appropriate ratio, or the regulator's expecting you to have one appropriate ratio, and that would tend to suggest then that everybody should be getting some fixed, which is non-variable and non-revocable and not performance related and so on. So I can't say this is impossible now, not off the top of my head anyway, but there's not much room left for it.
There's going to be some challenge. Well, I think that that was very helpful. I'm sure we can always follow up on that one further if needed. So do get in touch. I'm conscious of the time. I'd say thank you everyone for attending today. Again, in particular, thanks to both Chris and Joe. And we hope a number of you will all attend our next webinar, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.